listening, squirrels. It just dawned on me that I forgot to read this morning. Sitting here with my feet up and my lap is piled full of stuff to do. Still on this, though, I want to finish this hat. Chapter 14, A Danger Averted. This is Anne of Avonlea. Anne, walking home from the post office one Friday evening, was joined by Mrs. Lynde, who was, as usual, cumbered with all the cares of church and state. "I've just been down to see Timothy Cotton's to see if I could get Alice Louise to help me for a few days," she said. "I had her last week, though she's too slow to stop quick. She's better than nobody. But she's sick and can't come. Timothy's sitting there, too, coughing and complaining. He's been dying for 10 years. He'll go on dying for 10 years more. That can't even die and have done with it. They can't stick to anything, even to being sick long enough to finish it. They're a terrible, shiftless family. And what is to become of them, I don't know, but perhaps Providence does." Mrs. Lynde sighed as if she rather doubted the extent of providential knowledge on the subject. "Marilla was in about her eyes again Tuesday, wasn't she? What did the specialist think of them?" she continued. "He was much pleased," said Anne brightly. "He says there's a great improvement in them, and he thinks the danger of her losing her sight is completely past. But he says she'll never be able to read much or do any fine handwork again." It would be terrible. "How are your preparations for your bazaar coming on?" The Ladies' Aid Society was preparing for a fair and supper, and Mrs. Lynde was the head and front of the enterprise. "Pretty well. That reminds me, Mrs. Allen thinks it would be nice to fix up a booth, like an old-timey kitchen, and serve a supper of baked beans, doughnuts, pie, and so on. We're collecting old-fashioned fixings everywhere. Mrs. Simon Fletcher is going to lend us her mother's braided rugs, and Mrs. Levi Bolter some old chairs, and Aunt Mary Shaw will lend us her cupboard with the glass doors. I suppose Marilla will let us have her brass candlesticks, and we all want the old dishes. We want all the old dishes we can get. Mrs. Allen especially set on having a real blue willow-ware platter, if we can find one. But nobody seems to have one. Do you know where we could get one?" "Miss Josephine Barry has one. I'll write and ask if she'll lend it for the occasion," said Anne. "Well, I wish you would. I guess we'll have the supper in about a fortnight's time. Uncle Abe Andrews is prophesying rain and storms for about that time, and that's a pretty sure sign we'll have fine weather." Uncle Abe, it may be mentioned, was at least like other prophets in that he had small honor in his own country. He was in fact considered in the light of a standing joke, for few of his weather predictions were ever fulfilled. Mr. Elisha Wright, who labored under the impression that he was a local wit, used to say that nobody in Avonlea ever thought of looking in the Charlottetown dailies for weather probabilities. No, they just asked Uncle Abe what it was going to be tomorrow and expected the opposite. Nothing daunted, Uncle Abe kept on prophesying. "We want to have the fair over before the election comes off," continued Mrs. Lynde, "for the candidates will be sure to come and spend lots of money. The Tories are bribing right and left, so they might as well be given a chance to spend their money honestly for once." Anne was a red-hot conservative out of loyalty to Matthew's memory, but she said nothing. She knew better than to get Mrs. Lynde started on politics. She had a letter from Marilla postmarked from a town in British Columbia. "It's probably from the children's uncle," she said excitedly when she got home. Oh, Marilla, I wonder what he says about them. The best plan might be to open it and see, said Marilla curtly. A close observer might have thought that she was excited also, but she would rather have died than showed it. Anne tore open the letter and glanced over the somewhat untidy and poorly written contents. He says he can't take the children this spring. He's been sick most of the winter and his wedding is put off. He wants to know if we can keep them till the fall and he'll try and take them. We will, of course, won't we, Marilla? I don't see that there's anything else for us to do, said Marilla rather grimly, although she felt a secret relief. Anyhow, they're not so much trouble as they were, or else we've got used to them. Davy has improved a great deal. His manners are certainly much better, said Anne cautiously, as if she were not prepared to say as much for his morals. Anne had come home from school the previous evening to find Marilla away at an aid meeting. Dora slept on the kitchen sofa, and Davy in the sitting room closet, blissfully absorbing the contents of a jar of Marilla's famous yellow plum preserves, company jam, Davy called it, which he had been forbidden to touch. He looked very guilty when Anne pounced on him and whisked him out of the closet. Davy Keith, don't you know that's very wrong of you to be eating that jam when you were told never to meddle with anything in that closet? Yes, I know it was wrong, admitted Davy uncomfortably, but plum jam's awful nice, and I just peeped in, and it looked so good I thought I'd just take a weeny taste. I stuck my finger in and groaned and licked it clean, and it was so much gooder than I'd ever thought that I got a spoon and just sailed in. Anne gave him such a serious lecture on the sin of stealing plum jam that Davy became conscience stricken and promised with repentant kisses never to do it again. Anyhow, there'll be plenty of jam in heaven, that's one comfort, he said complacently. Anne nipped a smile in the bud. Perhaps there will if we want it, she said, but what makes you think so? Why, it's in the catechism, said Davy. Oh, no, there's nothing like that in the catechism, Davy. But I tell you there is, persisted Davy. It was in that question Marilla taught me last Sunday. Why should we love God, it says, because he makes preserves and redeems us. Preserves is just a holy way of saying jam. I must get a drink of water, said Anne hastily when she came back. It cost her some time and trouble to explain to Davy that a certain comma in the said catechism question made a great deal of difference in the meaning. Well, I thought it was too good to be true, he said. Oh my gosh. Did I read it right? He makes preserves and redeems us. Oh, he makes, comma. The comma was left out, yeah. Makes, preserves, and redeems us. Okay. Okay, I thought it was too good to be true, he said at last with a sigh of disappointed conviction. And besides, I didn't see when he'd find time to make jam if it's one endless Sabbath day, as the hymn says. I don't believe I'm going to go to heaven. Won't there ever be any Saturdays in heaven, Anne? Yes, Saturdays and every... These cooties flying around in here are fruit flies. I've been putting my used tea bags in plastic bags because that's what brought them in. My fruity teas. I had a frog in here last night. I'm sorry, I'm squirreling. A tree frog. I was standing at the back, out the back door. Door's just cracked a little bit. And that daggum little tree frog, well, he was big for a tree frog. about that big. But he was close to jumping in my vinegar. Well, I don't know if he would have or not. I don't guess they're tree frogs. I don't guess they jump in water. But he was right there where my vinegar water pan was. Two of them on the floor in the kitchen. Still from. Guess I can dump it out now. That's before I was about out of vinegar. But I thought he's gonna jump as soon as I go to pick him up. I got a paper towel. I ain't picking up jumping things. Ugh. So I picked him up with the paper towel real gingerly and just put him out. But he didn't move, not airy a bit. Sorry. That was too good to be Saturdays. Every day in heaven will be more beautiful than the one before, Davy assured Anne, who was rather glad that Marilla was not by to be shocked. Marilla, it is needless to say, was bringing the twins up in the good old ways of theology and discouraged all fanciful speculations thereupon. Davy and Dora were taught a hymn, a catechism question, and 2 Bible verses every Sunday. Dora learned meekly and recited like a little machine with perhaps as much understanding or interest as if she were one. Davy, on the contrary, had a lively curiosity and frequently asked questions which made Marilla tremble for his fate. Chester Sloane says we'll do nothing all the time in heaven but walk around in white dresses and play on harps, and he says he hopes he won't have to go till he's an old man, 'cause maybe then he'll like it better. And he thinks it will be hard to wear dresses, and I think so too. Why can't men angels wear trousers, Anne? Chester Sloane is interested in those things, 'cause they're going to make a minister of him. He's got to be. He's got to be a minister 'cause his grandmother left him money to send him to college, and he can't have it unless he is a minister. She thought a minister was such a respectable thing to have in a family. Chester says he doesn't mind much, though he'd rather be a blacksmith, but he's bound to have all the fun he can before he begins to be a minister, 'cause he doesn't expect to have much afterwards. I ain't going to be a minister. I'm going to be a storekeeper like Mr. Blair and keep heaps of candy and bananas. But I'd rather like going to your kind of a heaven if they let me play a mouth organ instead of a harp. Do you suppose they would? Yes, I think they would if you wanted it, was all Anne could trust herself to say. The AVIS met at Mr. Harmon Andrews that evening, and a full attendance had been requested, since important business was to be discussed. The AVIS was in a flourishing condition and had already accomplished wonders. Early in the spring, Mr. Major Spencer had redeemed his promise and had stumped, graded, and seeded down all the road front of his farm. A dozen other men, some prompted by determination not to let a Spencer get ahead of them, others goaded into action by improvers in their own household, and followed his example. The result was that there were long strips of smooth velvet turf where once had been unsightly undergrowth or brush. The farm fronts that had been done looked so badly by contrast that their owners were secretly shamed into resolving to see what they could do another spring. The triangle of ground at the same crossroads had also been cleared and seeded down, and Anne's bed of geraniums, unharmed by any marauding cow, was already set out in the center. Altogether, the improvers thought they were beginning on they were getting on beautifully, even if Mr. Levi Bolter, tactfully approached by a carefully selected committee in regard to the same. Wait a minute. In regard to the old house on his upper farm, did bluntly tell them he wasn't going to have it meddled with. At this special meeting, they intended to draw up a petition to the school trustees, humbly praying that a fence be put around the school grounds, and a plan was able to be discussed for planting a few ornamental trees by the church if the funds of the society would permit of it. For, as Anne said, there was no use in starting another subscription as long as the hall remained blue. The members were assembled in the Andrews parlor, and Jane was already on her feet to move the appointment of a committee which should find out and report on the price of the said trees. When GrannyDee Pie swept in, pompadoured and frilled within an inch of her life, Gertie had a habit of being late to make her entrance more effective, spiteful people said. Gertie's entrance in this instant was certainly effective, for she paused dramatically in the middle of the floor, threw up her hands, rolled her eyes, and exclaimed, "I've just heard something perfectly awful. What do you think? Mr. Judson Parker is going to rent all the road fence. Of his farm to a patent medicine company to paint advertisements on." For once in her life, Gertie Pie made all the sensation she desired. If she had thrown a bomb among the complacent improvers, she could hardly have made more. "It can't be true," said Anne blankly. "That's just what I said when I first heard it, don't you know," said Gertie, who was enjoying herself hugely. "I said it couldn't be true. That Judson Parker wouldn't have the heart to do it, don't you know? But Father met him this afternoon and asked him about it, and he said it was true. Just fancy, his farm is side on to the New Bridge Road, and how perfectly awful it will look to see advertisements of pills and plasters all along it, don't you know." I'm going to have to stop there, guys. I'm getting very thirsty, don't you know. Forgot to bring my drink out. Well, I wasn't planning on reading, but then I remembered that I hadn't. So be sweet. Don't be ugly. Have a good Saturday night. And hope to see you tomorrow live at 3. Tea at 3. Bye-bye.